Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about schizophrenia, which is a very, very wide topic. One in which there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of nuance to be had. So I want, before we start really digging into this, really emphasize that this is going to be like an overview of schizophrenia. So we're going to talk about what is schizophrenia, what are the treatment modalities, what are the outcomes, and how to work with someone who has schizophrenia. So let's start with what is schizophrenia. Well, schizophrenia is a severe mental illness which implies a state of psychosis, at least when it's triggered. So that state of psychosis is characterized by two fundamental components: hallucinations and delusions, or delirium. So hallucinations are the fact of hearing, smelling, seeing, or feeling something that isn't there. So for the person, that experience, and I have to stretch this, is not a fabrication. They're really experiencing it in their subjectivity, but as an external observer, you can't see it, feel it, or hear it. But the person is living through it. It's their lived experience. So it's very important for us to all be on the same page. This is not a lie, because often, unfortunately, people think that those people are lying, which isn't true. They're experiencing it. That's the whole issue, is that it's, for them, it is true in their subjectivity and in their way of perceiving the world. So that's for the hallucinations. I should also put a nuance here that hallucinations can be positive or negative. So that doesn't mean good or bad, but it means positive that they see something new. Let's say, for example, they see a tentacle, let's say, and negative hallucination is that there's something there, for example, a person, but they do not see the person, do not register the person as existing or as being perceived. So that's quite an interesting and important nuance. So hallucinations are experienced. They also, at the very start, when they happen, when the person starts or begins or collapses into psychosis, the hallucinations are not criticizable. The person cannot say, this is a hallucination. Often they are completely engulfed, emotionally speaking, into the hallucinations. And often the hallucinations are morally very severe, ruthless with them. For example, it's not rare for schizophrenics to hear voices that insult them, that, for example, treat them very, very, very poorly, very inhumanely. And often when you see people yelling on the street or talking aggressively on the street and who have clearly signs of psychosis, that's what they're doing. They're answering the voices. They are trying to fight back against those perceptions. So that's why they can be verbally quite violent. It's not against another person, it's against the hallucinations very, very often. And what you have to understand is that it's a source of a lot of suffering. So after we have the delusions or the delirium, so these symptoms are more like belief that is uncriticizable. For example, there's no one delusion, but for example, religious delusions, for example, believing that one is a prophet, or one is the son of God, or one is God in the skies, and so on and so forth. It's a belief that cannot be criticized even by facts and logic, right? It's something that's beyond reasoning. It's a truth for the person that states it, which means that they are fully convinced of what is happening. And often the therapeutic work is to try and make them understand that those beliefs are not necessarily real, or get them to question those beliefs, but not in that imposing dogmatic way, but really trying to deconstruct what is happening for them and why these moments are not true. And just doing it through logic is often not enough, as one has to create an emotional connection with the patient for the patient to feel secure enough to talk about the delusions and the hallucinations. That's something also that people often forget, that when they're not in a state of crisis, schizophrenic people often feel their hallucinations and symptoms as being very private because they understand that the others don't hear it or understand it in the same way. Therefore, they hide it a lot, even from therapists or psychiatrists, because they're afraid of being perceived as mad and being dismissed, both in their agency and in who they are. So in order to try and avoid the suffering and being isolated, they tend to not talk about it, even if questioned or pressed by mental health professionals. So in my experience at least, it takes a while for the patient to be secure enough to be able to talk about what is happening subjectively to them, because if they feel all of that, they also understand that it is uncommon to have those perceptions and feelings. So this is for the hallucinations and the delusions. So here I was very quick on this, but you have to understand there's a lot of nuances in all of this, because a delusion might be more subtle or more extreme according to the person, their life, and so on and so forth. Also, I have to precise that because I'm a psychodynamic theory, I do believe that there is a meaning to the delusion, but it's not a meaning that's interpretable, meaning you can't give an interpretation on the delusion. It's often considered as a real faux pas, because the psychotic individual, at least this is how we conceive it in psychodynamic theory, has the meaning of their lives has broken down because of the psychosis. So what the psychosis does, at least in the positive symptoms, i.e. when there's a production of something, when there's a delusion or hallucination, well, what is happening is they re-injecting meaning into their lives by the delusion. And the delusion is a desperate attempt to try and rebuild meaning with what has been destroyed. So in this sense, they don't lack meaning. They already have too much meaning. So interpretation or re-putting a meaning on top of the meaning is not right, in the fact that it doesn't help them necessarily. What does help them though a lot, what I've found, is that when you create a connection with them, they find a secure interpersonal relationship in which they can fundamentally talk about their subjectivity, something that often the environment, family, friends, feel very uncomfortable navigating, because let's be real, society, in terms of society, we never talk about delusions, we never talk about hallucinations or how to handle them, how to talk about them, how to exchange with someone that is having them. So we don't have the tools collectively to do so. So often a mental health professional is someone that can hear that there is those sets of issues and can try and help. So in terms of the help, we have two main forms of help. We have medication and psychotherapy. There's also everything that's to do with support. There can be art therapy, it can be social groups, and so on and so forth. And all of that is very good. What matters is that the person finds what works for them. Medication is often something that is very important to negate the symptoms, or at least diminish the symptoms I've been talking about. For example, medication like antipsychotics or neuroleptics, as they're called, can help diminish the hallucinations. For example, patients say that they hear less voices, or the voices are less nasty with them. Or on the contrary, that they don't, for example, have as many delusions, or they can do a bit of triage or criticize the delusions. However, treatment is ineffective to treat negative symptoms. So what are negative symptoms of schizophrenia? Well, often negative symptoms is the withdrawal. The patient is going to withdraw within themselves, not talk, not exchange with others. They're going to start showing less and less emotions, less and less investment into the world. They're going to have what is called abulia, meaning that they're going to lack motivation to do stuff. And it's going to be very hard to motivate them to do something. And fundamentally, outside of the more pleasurable experiences like smoking, eating, or having a chat, it might be very difficult. And even having a chat might be incredibly difficult for certain individuals. So instead of what is pleasurable, and at an extreme level, but that's not like everyone, but at an extreme level there can be catatonia, i.e. a complete withdrawal. There's no interactions at some point there might not even be any interactions whatsoever. They might not even look at you, they might not even see you, they might even talk to you. Even if you're talking to them, asking them questions, they might completely ignore you. And that is in the more severe cases. In these cases of negative symptoms, yet again, negative and positive here don't mean moral, like good or bad. It just, positive means that something is created, negative means something is lost. So fundamentally, negative symptoms are not helped by pharmaceutical treatment. And we are, as today, quite unsure what helps. There might be some good results with psychotherapy, but it's not a given. Like, I don't want to get anyone's hopes super high, because even then the research is quite conflicted. Not everyone agrees, and from what I understand, schizophrenia in its treatment is very subtle, and what works for one patient might not work for another. There's also this complicated topic that, at least according to me, schizophrenics need a network of support. And when I mean that, from my professional experience, what I've seen what works really well is if there's an institution, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, an educator, family, adapted job, and so on and so forth. Like, the more the merrier, in a way. The more people can come into the frame of the schizophrenic, the better the outcome is. At least that's what I've seen. And the less people are in the circle or in the treatment plan of the person, the more complicated it's going to get. Also, and I should note this, even though it's not like necessarily a symptom per se, often people who have schizophrenia, at least at the beginning, have what is called anosognosia. A very, very complicated word to say that they don't often recognize that they have a mental illness. For them, it's just normal. It's okay. That's their truth. And often they don't realize that it's part of a mental disorder. So that's where the psychotherapy really can give a benefit, is to help the patient understand what are the symptoms. Because what you have to keep in mind is that all of this hides or underlines a lot of suffering, emotional suffering. Suffering that's not necessarily accessible from the get-go to the patient because of all the delusions, all the voices. And the voices can sometimes go against the therapist. Like, for example, they might say things like, don't talk to him, don't trust him, and so on and so forth. So as a therapist, you have to kind of work with the voices. The voices are not to be considered like neurotic symptom. I think the best way of considering the hallucinations and the voices is consider them like if there was a third person or two extra people in the session with the schizophrenic and the therapist, meaning that it's like a group session in which you have to understand what the voices are saying, what are they saying, and of course, for you to get access to those voices as a therapist needs a lot of work with the patient. The patient has to know that they can trust you on a deep level, not just like you're the psychologist, therefore you can say everything. No, they really have to feel that you're trying to connect with them, for them to try and let go and talk about all of this. They can also feel very quickly persecuted. Persecution that might not last. They can feel very persecuted at the moment, and then a couple of weeks later it can grow better. So it's not like paranoia where it's constant. This is more discontinuous in essence. So fundamentally, the treatments that we have now are pharmaceutical for positive treatments, and we try and also associate that with psychotherapy. And the more social interventions there are, the better, if the person, of course, is willing. Because that's also a very important point, is that the person also has to be an agent of their treatment plan. But the treatment plan cannot be just the goal of their life. They have to have something else, like a project or something that they want in their life. Treatment is only there to support them getting their life back and trying to experiment with life. When I'm saying that in very broad strokes, right? And one objective for one person might not be the objective of another person. So it's very, very, very nuanced. Here I'm really giving an outline of schizophrenia rather than like every single detail of this mental illness. Also, what is very important, I think, to talk about is how society sees them. Because unfortunately, nowadays, it's getting better, but unfortunately, as schizophrenia has fundamentally this unfortunately been considered as a dangerous and somewhat violent mental illness. Truth be told, people who have schizophrenia are not violent. They're even less violent than the bigger part of the population. However, because of the representation in media, there's been a stigma associated with it, that they're violent, ruthless, psychopathic, uncaring, unloving, which they're not. And I have to stretch this. Schizophrenic people can be very loving and caring. They just have a mental illness. What is believed now is that if they are brutal, violent, and so on and so forth, is that there's other things associated with it, like, for example, a lack of empathy and antisocial personality disorder and other stuff that comes in, but it's not schizophrenia itself. And that I have to be very clear, because unfortunately there's been a lot of misunderstandings and cliches who have been circulating throughout decades and decades and decades. So it's very stigmatizing, but one should not be afraid of schizophrenics. Often they're non-violent, and the violence that happens is towards them. For example, they might be physically abused, raped, extorted. The violence is often committed towards them. It's not something that they themselves commit towards others. And I think that that's very important to be able to talk about it and be able to have a conversation. Also, what should be mentioned is that schizophrenic people are 20 to 40% more likely to commit suicide. That suicidality is linked to the fact that they're isolated. They're isolated, and the voices, the hallucinations, the delusions are forms of suffering, deep, deep, deep forms of suffering, in which one is locked, and sometimes they can feel an immense form of despair. In those moments, hospitalization is necessary to try and alleviate the symptoms, try and see if something can work, because sometimes one neuroleptic might no longer work, and something else needs to be tried. In a way, and that's what I was taught, is that in terms of schizophrenia, everything that hasn't been tried is worth trying. In the fact that some things might match, and when you wouldn't believe it at the start, you might think, for example, art therapy. For certain people, art therapy has helped them to get out of negative symptoms, to try and interact with the world, to try and do something, to be happy and playful, much more than what one would believe on the surface. But for some other people, it might not work. So it's really, at least in my conception as a psychologist, it's really a case-by-case basis for schizophrenia. There might be common ground, but how we treat it, what works, so quote-unquote, is very subtle. And I should mention also that I haven't met any schizophrenic people who haven't had some form of trauma, be it incest, be it being beaten, be it being harassed, being excluded, being rejected, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that trauma is unfortunately something that has an effect upon the psyche. And what we now believe is that schizophrenia as an etiology is multifactorial. We believe, scientifically speaking, that what is happening is that there is a constitutional vulnerability, meaning that, for example, in the being of the person, there's something that hasn't been there or has been unable to fully adapt. And unfortunately, because life events like trauma happen, that fragility is hurt by the impact of trauma, and then there's a breakdown. So the breakdown is often happens during teenagehood and early adulthood. Often after 25 is the peak of the breakdowns, and after it like evens out, and 35 afterwards, it's much rarer. There are some cases where psychotic breakdowns happen in, for example, at menopause or even old age, but they're rarer. They're much rarer. Often they happen in late teens, early 20s. That's for the most cases. And I think for women it's like late 20s. There's a slight difference. Women is slightly later. Anyway, often what happens is that they will, when they break down, there's all a complete psychotic breakdown in which the person is going to be attacked virtually by hallucinations, delusions, and it's going to be massive. Or the phase of entry might be very discreet. The person withdraws, doesn't talk anymore, doesn't interact anymore, is completely inhibited. They answer wrongly to questions that are evident and the person should know the answer to. So all of these things are signs that the person might be starting to have psychosis. And of course they start having strange idiosyncratic ways of believing things, and things that they can't really justify, like they don't really explain their train of thought and it seems a bit strange. All of that are signs. Unfortunately nowadays we don't know exactly how to prevent someone from triggering psychosis. Like we don't know what is the focal point that's going to trigger it. So for example, for Lacan, and coming back to psychoanalysis, for Lacan, for example, it's the fact that something in the environment triggers something that is of the real, i.e. it's something that has been rejected out of the unconscious, a foreclosure, something that's been kicked out and it comes back. And that coming back is what breaks the mind in a way. And that foreclosure, that return of the foreclosure, is something that is very unpredictable, as it can be something that can be like, it can be anything from loss of a relative, the death of a relative, to moving apartments, to even a marriage. So it's really tough to guess what's going to happen for the patient. What we can see, however, is people that are more vulnerable than others. Also, we know that smoking cannabis also increases the risk of triggering it. Cannabis does not cause psychosis, but if there's a vulnerability, it might trigger it in a way. So it's not the cause, but it can be the trigger. I'm saying this because even though cannabis has been, nowadays it's completely normal to smoke it or considered socially, it still puts people at risk because people who are vulnerable might trigger psychosis because of it. It's also the case with mushrooms. So it's not to say that it has to be repressed or stuff like that, but people have to still be careful. It's not risk-free, that's what I'm trying to say. So fundamentally, and this was an overview of schizophrenia, what you have to keep in mind is that it's a very subtle mental illness. For all the bravado of its extreme examples, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of subtlety in how every individual lives their experiences, how they experience the world, the symptoms, and themselves. And this subtlety is often lost in the cultural representations that we have. Unfortunately, it's a subtlety that needs to be put back into our thinking, as all these nuances need to be taken into account in the treatment of people who have schizophrenia. And I will also, and I will end like this, say that as a therapist, you shouldn't be afraid of talking with people who have schizophrenia or taking them in treatment, as long as they're also followed by a psychiatrist, because they need that medical help. But as a therapist, you can work with them and you can try and help them. It won't be easy, and the symptoms might not be alleviated by psychotherapy. But the fact of talking with another individual, the fact of feeling free in their discourse about their hallucinations, about what they're experiencing, can be incredibly liberating for them. Because for once they find someone that's able to listen, to hear, and understand that what they're experiencing without shutting them off, without cutting them because they're feeling uncomfortable. They can really find another human, and that human connection is something that, at least in my experience, helps them a lot. Even if it doesn't heal them of their symptoms, it helps them at least to realize that they're not alone in this world, and that can be very, very helpful. So I'll leave you on that note. If you have any questions or anything that I have missed, because it's so wide, this topic, I have missed stuff, and I know I have missed stuff, but that's what it is. Feel free to put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.